The letter hit the kitchen table like a verdict. Inez Bancroft stood in the center of Grant Warren's house, a house she had cleaned and cooked in and quietly loved for 4 months, and read the words that unraveled everything she thought she understood about the man who slept down the hall. Her hands were not shaking. She had trained herself long ago not to shake, not to show the fractures forming beneath her skin. But her breath came in short, controlled pulls, and the single candle on the table threw her shadow, long and trembling against the wall, as if even her silhouette could not hold itself together. The letter was addressed to Grant Warren, Sweetwater Ridge, Texas, and it had arrived 3 days ago. She had not meant to read it. She had been dusting the kitchen shelves, and it had slipped from between two coffee tins where he had apparently tucked it, forgotten or deliberately hidden, and it had opened as it fell, and the first line had reached up and grabbed her by the throat. The girl does not know the truth. Keep it that way. The arrangement stands. Those 12 words. That was all it took to make her world tilt sideways. Because the girl, Inez now understood with nauseating clarity, was her. She was the girl. And the arrangement, the position as housekeeper that she had answered in the Abilene Gazette 8 weeks after her husband's death left her penniless and desperate and terrified, was not what she had believed it to be. Someone had placed that advertisement knowing she would see it. Someone had moved her like a piece on a chess board to this remote ranch in the Texas Hill Country, and the man she had begun to trust, perhaps even begun to love in the careful, cautious way a woman loves when she has already been burned once, was at the center of it. She folded the letter and set it back on the table. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood very still in the candlelight and made herself breathe, and she thought about everything she had observed about Grant Warren in 4 months, every detail she had filed away in the quiet archive of a woman who had learned that observation was survival. She thought about how he had looked the morning she arrived at Sweetwater Ridge, standing on the porch of this house with his hat in his hands and something in his eyes that she could only describe now, in retrospect, as guilt. She had mistaken it for grief. She had been told he was a widower, and grief made sense for a man who stood in the doorway of a house that felt hollowed out, whose kitchen shelves held 2 plates and 1 cup and a coffee tin, with the name of a woman scratched off the bottom. She had thought the guilt was grief. Maybe it had been both. She pulled her shawl tighter and sat down in the chair she had come to think of as hers, the one by the window that caught the morning light, and she went back to the beginning. She went all the way back to Abilene, to the mud-colored boarding house where she had lived for 6 weeks after the funeral, to the newspaper folded in half on the common room table, to the single line of advertisement that had felt like Providence reaching down into her despair. Housekeeper wanted. Sweetwater Ridge Ranch, Careville, Texas. Honest work, fair wage, private quarters. Inquire Grant Warren. She had inquired. She had written the most careful, dignified letter she had ever composed, describing her qualifications without mentioning the humiliation of having to list them. And 3 days later a reply had come, already accepting her, and she had thought, with the desperate gratitude of a woman who had nowhere else to turn, that perhaps her luck had finally turned. She had not known, riding the stage south and then west through the hill country, that luck had nothing to do with it. She had not known there was a dark past attached to her name, a secret she had not been told, and that it had reached ahead of her and arranged everything she was walking into. Grant Warren's boots hit the porch steps at 6 in the morning, same as always, and Inez heard them and did not move. He came through the door with the cold November air riding his coat, and he stopped when he saw her sitting at the table in the gray pre-dawn light, not cooking, not moving, the letter folded in front of her. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. And in that long, revealing moment before he said a single word, she watched his face do something she had never seen it do in 4 months. It crumpled, just for a second, just long enough to be the truest thing she had seen from him. "Inez," he said. "Sit down," she said, "and tell me everything. Start with who sent that letter and do not stop until there is nothing left to tell." He sat down. He set his hat on the table. He ran one large, work-roughened hand over his jaw, and she could see the exhaustion on him, the specific weight of a man who has been carrying a secret so long it has become part of his skeleton. "Your father," he said. "It was your father." The name of her father, spoken in this kitchen at this hour, was the last thing she had expected. Her father had been dead for 11 years, or so she had been told. She leaned forward slowly. "Say that again." "Your father, Inez, Inez Bancroft, he is not dead." The candle between them flickered, and the silence that followed those 5 words was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Inez Bancroft had not died in the Galveston flood of 1875. That was the story her mother had told her, the story she had carried like a stone in her chest for 11 years, the dark cornerstone on which she had built her understanding of loss. Her mother had told her. Her mother had wept. Her mother had, and this was the detail that now rewrote everything, moved them from Galveston to Abilene within 3 months of the flood, far from anyone who might know the truth. Grant set his hands flat on the table. "He reached out to me 14 months ago. He knew I needed help running this place after Alina died. He knew I needed someone reliable, someone honest. And he said he knew exactly the right person, but that she couldn't know he was involved because she thought he was dead. And if she knew he was alive, she'd have questions he wasn't ready to answer yet." "You agreed to that," Inez said, and her voice was very quiet, which meant it was very dangerous, and some instinct in Grant seemed to register that because he did not look away from her. "I agreed to hire you. I agreed to let him make the introduction through the newspaper. I did not agree to lie to you or to use you." He stopped. "But I did lie to you by omission. By silence, and I know that's the same thing." Inez stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the pre-dawn dark of the ranch, the shadow of the barn, the pale stripe of the horizon beginning to separate itself from the sky. She had cleaned every inch of this house. She knew the grain of every floorboard, the particular squeak of the second step on the stairs, the way the kitchen door had to be lifted slightly when you closed it or it would not latch. She had made this place livable again, and somewhere in the doing of it she had made it feel like home, and that was the thing that hurt most of all. "Where is he?" she asked. "My father. Where is he?" "Careville," Grant said. "He runs the dry goods store on Main Street. He's been there 6 years." She had ridden through Careville twice on the supply wagon, twice. She might have passed him on the street and not known. She turned from the window. "I need a horse." "Inez, I need a horse, and I need to go to Careville, and when I come back we are going to have a very different conversation than the one we just had." She looked at him with everything she felt, the betrayal, the shock, the complicated grief of a secret unraveling, and she added quietly, "And you and I are not finished, Grant Warren, but we cannot begin until I know what it is I am standing in the middle of." He gave her the horse. He gave her his best one, the gray mare he called Nothing, because he didn't name his horses anymore. And he saddled her himself in the pale morning cold without being asked. And when Inez mounted, she looked down at him and saw the guilt again, the same guilt she had seen on his face the very first day, and now she understood it entirely. The road to Careville was 12 miles of limestone and cedar, and the particular silence of the hill country in November, when the live oaks hold their leaves and the sky goes silver, and the only sound is the horse's hooves on the Caliche road. Inez rode in that silence and let herself feel everything she had been holding back in the kitchen. She let herself feel the betrayal and the confusion, and under it, persistent and inconvenient as a splinter, the memory of every small moment she had stored without meaning to. Grant reading at the table in the evenings. Grant leaving a cup of coffee on the porch for her without saying anything, exactly the temperature she drank it, which meant he had noticed. Grant fixing the latch on the root cellar she had mentioned exactly once in passing, because the broken latch made her nervous after dark. Grant and his silences that did not feel like absence but like presence. She pushed those memories aside. She would deal with them later. First, she would deal with her father. Inez Bancroft's Dry Goods on Main Street in Careville was a narrow building with a green-painted sign, and a window display of flour sacks and bolts of calico. Inez tied the mare to the post and stood in front of the door for a long moment, her hand on the latch, and then she walked in. The man behind the counter looked up. He was 63 years old, and she knew him immediately. The way you know a face you have spent years trying to forget, because forgetting never really works. He was thinner than she remembered, with white hair where the brown had been and deep lines carved by sun and years, but his eyes were her eyes, the same dark hazel, and when he saw her, his face did the same thing Grant's had done that morning. It crumpled. "Inez," he said, in a voice like a door opening on a room that had been shut too long. "You lied," she said, not as an accusation, as a fact she needed him to sit with. "You let us believe you were dead, for 11 years. He came around the counter slowly. He looked like a man approaching someone who might run, and she supposed she might. "Your mother and I, what we had was broken long before the flood. She wanted a clean end. I was willing to give her that, but I should never have let 11 years go by, I know that." "Why now?" Inez asked. "Why this? Why use Grant Warren to bring me here?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you were alone in Abilene and I was afraid for you. Because your husband left you with nothing and I knew you needed work and I knew Grant Warren needed help and I knew—" He stopped. He seemed to gather himself. "I knew Grant Warren is a good man, Inez. A broken man, maybe, but a good one. And I thought that if I sent you to him and let things happen naturally, without forcing anything, without making promises I had no right to make, I thought maybe you'd find something in that place." Inez looked at her father across the narrow dry goods store with its smells of sawdust and coffee and calico, and she felt 11 years pressing on her chest. She felt her mother's weeping. She felt every prayer she had said at a grave that was empty. "You had no right," she said. "Not to keep the secret and not to arrange my life without telling me." "No," he agreed, "I didn't. And yet," she said slowly, "you are here, and you are alive, and I do not know yet what to do with that." They sat in the back room of the dry goods store with 2 cups of weak coffee and a small cast iron stove. And Inez Bancroft told his daughter the truth at last, the full and unadorned truth that should have been told 11 years earlier. He and her mother had agreed on the deception after the flood, when the flood provided convenient cover for a man who wanted to disappear from a marriage that had failed. And he had made the worst decision of his life because he was a coward, and he had been paying for it ever since. He had followed her from a distance for years, had known about her marriage to Thomas Bancroft and its early promise and its slow erosion, had known when Thomas died and left her with nothing. And when he saw the advertisement in the Abilene paper for domestic help in Careville, he had made a second mistake by taking a coward's route to amends. Inez listened to all of it. She asked precise questions when she needed clarification. She did not weep, because she had spent her tears on him at 14 and had none left for him at 29. But when he finished and sat across from her with his old hands wrapped around his cup, she looked at him and thought about what it meant to hope for something from a person who had already failed you. She thought, unexpectedly, about Grant. "He felt guilty," she said, more to herself than to Elias. "Grant. He felt guilty the entire time. He hated the arrangement almost from the moment you arrived," Elias said quietly. "He wrote to me 3 weeks in and told me he wanted to tell you the truth. I talked him out of it. I told him to wait, that I'd come to you myself, that I needed more time." Elias shook his head. "I kept asking for more time." She rode back to Sweetwater Ridge in the late afternoon, when the sun was going gold and flat across the cedar breaks and the limestone hills threw long shadows east. She had no resolution about her father yet, only the raw material of one, the first careful bricks of something that might eventually become understanding if she mortared them with enough patience. She was not there yet, but she had left the door unlocked. What she understood more clearly, riding back along the Caliche road with the gray mare moving easy under her, was that Grant Warren's guilt had been real, and it had been uncomfortable, and he had lived with it every day she was in his house, and that a man who had no conscience does not feel that particular kind of weight. She also understood, with the honesty she had always demanded from herself even when it was inconvenient, that she needed to know who Grant Warren actually was, underneath the secret that had brought her there, before she decided what any of it meant. So when she rode back into the yard at Sweetwater Ridge in the early evening, and Grant came out of the barn with a lantern and stood watching her dismount with his face carefully composed into neutrality, Inez Bancroft made a decision. She was not leaving. Not yet. She was going to stay, and she was going to find out who this man was when there were no secrets between them, and then she was going to decide. "My father is alive," she said, handing him the mare's reins. "I know. He is a complicated man who made a terrible choice and has been running from it ever since." She paused. "I think I understand it better than I want to." Grant looked at her. The lantern made his face warm and shadow-edged, and she could see the question in him, the careful, guarded question he would not ask because he did not think he had the right. "I'm not leaving," she said, "but we are going to start over from the beginning, you and I, and this time there will be no secrets." He let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 4 months. "All right," he said. "All right." Starting over, she learned, looked like this. Grant Warren at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in late November, with a cup of coffee he had made himself because she had told him firmly that she was a housekeeper and not a servant, and he was capable of heating water, telling her about Eleanor. Eleanor had been his wife for 6 years. She had died 18 months ago of a fever that came fast and wrong and took her in 11 days, and the death had left Grant with not only grief, but a particular species of guilt that she was starting to recognize in him. The guilt of a man who believes he is responsible for someone else's suffering, even when no rational accounting supports it. "She wanted to go to San Antonio," he said. "Her sister lives there, was always asking me to make the trip. I kept saying next season, there's too much to do here." He looked at his coffee. "She died having never made it. Her sister got here 2 days after." "You think that's your fault," Inez said. "I think a man who can't make time for the things that matter to the people he loves needs to examine himself." She looked at him across the table. 34 years old, with years of sun in his face and a scar above his left brow from a fence wire incident he'd mentioned once in passing, and the specific, bone-deep loneliness of a man who has been alone with his own judgment for 18 months. "What do you want, Grant?" she asked. "Not what do you think you deserve. What do you actually want?" He looked up from his coffee as if the question were in a language he had not spoken in a long time. "I don't think I remember how to want things." "That," she said, "is exactly what we're going to fix." December came to the hill country cold and bright, with frosts that silvered the cedar breaks in the mornings and ice crystals in the water troughs that Grant had to break each day. Inez settled into a new rhythm, different from the careful, slightly fearful efficiency of her first 4 months. She cleaned still and cooked, and kept the house running with the organized precision that was both her training and her nature, but she did it differently now. She did it as a woman who had made a choice to be somewhere, not a woman making herself useful enough to justify staying. She began to ask Grant questions at dinner, not careful, polite questions, but real ones. "Did you grow up here?" "On this land. My father built the house. He came from Tennessee in 1851. I was born here." "And you always knew you'd stay?" He thought about it. "I never thought about not staying. It was just this is the place. This is where I belong." He paused. "I used to think that was enough. And now," he looked at her with those dark eyes that she was learning to read, "now I think a person needs more than a piece of land. I think I knew that before, I just forgot." She brought home a book from the supply run to Careville. She had begun accompanying Grant on the monthly runs, sitting on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and the cold air sharp on her face, and she had begun going into the dry goods store to handle the shopping while Grant dealt with the feed merchant. And each time she went into the store, she spent a few more minutes with Inez Bancroft, slowly, carefully, building the fragile architecture of something that was not yet forgiveness, but was not refusal either. The book was a collection of poems, Walt Whitman, which she had read before and loved, and she set it on the kitchen table after dinner one evening, and Grant looked at it and said, "I haven't read anything except cattle ledgers in 2 years." "Read this," she said, and pushed it across to him. He read. She watched him read, from across the room where she was mending one of the curtains that had frayed along the hem, and she watched the particular quality of stillness that came over a man when words were reaching him somewhere important, and she thought that Grant Warren had been living in a very small, very closed room inside himself, and that each thing she offered him, a question, a book, a moment of honesty, was opening the room a little wider. On the 1st of January, 1884, Inez stood at the window in the early morning and watched the new year arrive in the form of a cedar waxwing flock moving through the live oaks, hundreds of them, like a river of wings. Grant came to stand beside her, not touching her, just standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold kitchen, and they watched the birds together in silence. "What do you hope for?" she asked him, "for this year?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said carefully, as if the words were fragile and he was not sure they could bear the weight of being spoken, "I hope that I am the kind of man worth staying for." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the birds, not at her, which she understood was how a man says something honest when honesty still frightens him. "You are learning to be," she said. "That counts for something." He turned then and looked at her, and the look between them was the longest one they had shared since the morning of the letter, and it held a question that neither of them was ready to answer yet, but that both of them now knew was there. February brought a blue norther that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in 2 hours and drove cattle into the ravines and turned the hill country white for 3 days, which was a rarity in that part of Texas. Grant was out with his 2 hands, Pedro Martinez and old Clay Briggs, for 18 hours the first day, bringing cattle in. Inez kept the stove running all day and had hot food and dry blankets ready when they came in, and when Grant finally came through the door at near midnight with ice on his hat brim and his hands barely working, she made him sit by the stove and took his hands in hers and chafed them warm without thinking about it, just doing it because it was necessary. He looked at her hands around his. He looked at her face. Neither of them said anything. But when feeling came back into his fingers and she started to pull away, his hands closed gently around hers and held on for just a moment, just 3 or 4 seconds of holding, and then released. She stood up and poured him coffee, and they spoke of the cattle, of which animals had been found and which were still missing, of the weather and the road conditions, and everything was ordinary and everything was different. Pedro Martinez, who was 26 and from San Antonio and observed things with a quiet, dark-eyed precision, came in from the bunkhouse the next morning and looked between Inez and Grant with a small smile he didn't bother to hide. Clay Briggs, who was 58 and had been working cattle since before the war and had opinions about everything, was rather more direct. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, accepting his breakfast plate, "you are the best thing that has happened to this ranch in a year and a half. I'm just saying." Grant looked at his eggs. Inez said, "Thank you, Clay," and refilled his coffee, and Pedro's small smile widened. In March, Inez received a letter from her mother in Abilene. Her mother, whose name was Ruth, had somehow found out that Inez Bancroft was alive and living in Careville, which meant someone had written to her, and Inez had a strong suspicion that someone was Elias himself, finally attempting the conversation he should have had 11 years ago. The letter was 3 pages, and it was painful to read, full of justifications and old wounds and the particular defensiveness of a woman who had told a lie for so long she had made peace with it. And at the bottom, in her mother's careful schoolteacher handwriting, was a single sentence that struck Inez with something like a key turning in a lock. "I am sorry I let you grieve for a man who was not dead. You deserve the truth. You always deserve the truth." Inez read that sentence 4 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the tin box under her bed where she kept important things, and she went downstairs and started the bread. And while she was working the dough, Grant came in from the morning chores and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "My mother wrote," she said. "She apologized." He He waited. I am working out what to do with that. She pushed the heels of her hands into the dough. It's strange. I spent a long time being angry about that particular lie. And now that she's admitted it, I feel less angry and more, I don't know. Sad, maybe. Sad for all the years it took. Grant poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, and she could feel him thinking. He was a man who thought carefully before speaking, which she had come to appreciate enormously. I think, he said slowly, that sometimes people carry a dark past so long it becomes the shape of them. They can't figure out how to put it down without putting down the shape too, so they just keep carrying it. She looked up from the bread. Is that what you did after Alina? I carried her death like it was a punishment I'd assigned to myself. He looked out the window, stopped making plans, stopped wanting things, just managed days. Until he looked at her. Until. She went back to the bread. The kitchen smelled of yeast and coffee and wood smoke, and outside the March wind was pushing clouds south across the sky, and Inez thought about what it meant that she had come here under false pretenses and built something real anyway. She thought about how the foundation of a thing does not always predict the structure that rises from it. She thought about hope, about what it actually was, not the airy, passive kind that sits and waits, but the active, stubborn kind that rolls up its sleeves and works. She thought that Grant Warren had forgotten how to do the active kind, and she thought she might be the person to show him how to remember. In April, the bluebonnets came up along the roadsides and across the limestone hills, and the hill country was blue and gold for 3 weeks, and Inez told Grant one afternoon that she wanted to ride out and see them properly, not from the wagon on the supply road, but actually ride out into the middle of them. He looked at her with something new in his expression, something lighter than she was used to, and said, I know a place. He saddled the horses himself, the gray mare for her and the bay gelding he called Ranger, the one exception to his rule about not naming horses, and they rode west along the ridge until the land opened up into a wide limestone basin, where the bluebonnets grew so thick the ground was blue as a lake, and the Indian paintbrush was orange-red among them, and it smelled sweet and alive in the April heat. They stopped the horses on the rim of the basin and looked down at it. Inez felt something in her chest release, some tightly held thing she had not known she was gripping. Alina loved this place, Grant said, and it was the first time he had mentioned Alina's name without the weight of guilt on it, just mentioned her. Just said her name like she was a real person he had loved, not a wound he was protecting. She had good taste, Inez said. He smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful, managed expression she had been coaxing out of him for months, but a sudden, unguarded smile that changed the whole architecture of his face, and Inez felt that smile like a physical thing, like sun coming through after cloud cover. Ride down with me, he asked. They rode down into the bluebonnets and walked the horses through them slowly, the blossoms brushing the horses' hocks, and Grant talked. He talked more than she had heard him talk in 5 months combined. He told her about growing up on this land, about learning to ride on Ranger's father, about his own father who had been a hard but fair man, about the way the hill country looked in drought years when the cedar turned gray and the grass burned off, about the way it looked in good rain years like this one. He talked about cattle and about limestone and about the particular beauty of this specific corner of Texas that he had never been able to articulate to anyone who hadn't seen it, and she listened with all of herself, the way she had learned to listen, and she heard under all the words the thing he was really saying. He was saying, I am still here. I am still inside this life. I had almost stopped believing that. When they turned back toward the ranch in the late afternoon, riding side by side along the ridge trail, he said, Thank you for making me come out here. You saddled the horses, she said. You said you wanted to see the bluebonnets. Before that, I would not have thought of it. Looked at the trail ahead. The cedar birds were calling in the trees, and the sky was going that particular evening blue of the hill country, transparent and deep. I think you would have eventually. Maybe, he said. It would have taken considerably longer. There was a pause, comfortable now, the kind of silence that does not need filling. Then Grant said, "Your father came by yesterday." She turned to look at him. "I know, I should have told you right away. He came by while you were in the kitchen garden. He asked how you were. Grant seemed to choose his words carefully. He looked like a man who is afraid he has run out of time to fix things." "He probably is afraid of exactly that," Inez said. "He should have thought of that 11 years ago." "He should have," Grant agreed. "But he didn't, and now here he is, afraid and old and hoping it is not too late." He glanced at her. "I think there is something familiar about that position." She knew he was not talking only about Elias. She let the observation stand between them without comment, because some things needed to be said and then left alone to settle. Inez Bancroft came for Sunday dinner in May. Inez had not invited him formally, but she had told Grant she supposed they could set a fourth place at the table if Elias found his way out on a Sunday, and Grant had passed this along through whatever channel had developed between the two men. And Elias appeared on the porch at noon on the third Sunday of May wearing his best coat and holding a jar of honey from his bees. It was not easy. Nothing between Inez and her father was easy yet, and probably would not be for a long time. But they sat at the table and ate the roast chicken and the cornbread and the preserved peaches she had put up in September. And Elias told a story about a mule that had gotten into his storeroom the previous week and had knocked over every tin he owned. And it was funny enough that Inez laughed before she remembered she was still angry at him. And the laughter cracked something open between them, just slightly, just enough. After dinner, Grant excused himself to check on the horses with a diplomatic tact she had not expected from him, but was coming to recognize as part of how he moved through the world, making space for people, stepping back when stepping back was what was needed. Elias and Inez sat on the porch with their coffee and watched the evening come on. "I wrote to your mother," Elias said. "I know she wrote to me. I don't expect forgiveness from her or from you. I know I don't deserve it on a timetable." Inez looked at the cedar breaks going dark in the dusk. A whippoorwill started up somewhere down in the draw, its call clear and insistent in the quiet. "I am not ready to forgive you," she said, "but I am willing to keep having dinner." He nodded, and she could see the effort it cost him not to reach for more than she was offering, and she gave him credit for the restraint. "Grant Warren," Elias said after a moment. "What do you think of him?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I think he is the kind of man who will spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of something, even when someone keeps telling him he already is." Elias glanced at her sidelong. "And who might be telling him that?" "Don't push your luck," she said, but without heat, and he smiled into his coffee cup, and that was the closest thing to comfortable they had managed in 6 months. In June, Pedro Martinez brought his mother out from San Antonio for a visit, and Maria Martinez spent one afternoon in Inez's kitchen, and declared the tortillas Inez had learned to make entirely acceptable, high praise from a woman who considered culinary judgment a form of moral seriousness. And Inez felt an uncomplicated pleasure in the endorsement that she hadn't felt in a long time. Simple good things, she was learning, had a healing power that complicated good things did not. Grant had begun doing something she noticed with a kind of quiet astonishment. He had begun making plans, small ones at first, almost tentative, a new fence line he wanted to extend in the fall. A trip to San Antonio he was considering for the annual cattle auction in September. The purchase of 2 additional mares he had been thinking about for years, but had kept deferring. She noticed each plan as she would notice a plant putting out new growth after a long dry season, and she said nothing about it directly because she knew that pointing at a thing sometimes made it shy back. But one evening in June, when he spread a land map on the kitchen table and began marking proposed fence lines with a pencil, talking out loud as he worked about the plan for expanding the grazing rotation, she came and stood beside him and looked at the map and asked intelligent questions about the terrain, and he moved slightly so she had more room to see, and their arms were side by side on the table, and neither of them moved away. "You're planning for 3 years out," she observed. 5 actually, he said, and the easy confidence in his voice was new, and she recognized it as the sound of a man who has started to believe he will be there for 5 years, who has started to assume a future. She turned her head and found him looking at her, not at the map. "Inez," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said quietly. "I am not good at this, at saying what I mean when it is something that matters." She waited. "When I think about this place 5 years from now," he said, "I think about it with you here. I have been thinking about it that way for a while, and I did not know what to do about that because I did not know if I had the right to want it." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm with the June evening coming through the windows, and the map lay between them with its pencil marks for fences that did not exist yet, plans for a future that was still being built. "You have the right to want things, Grant," she said. "I have been trying to tell you that for months." "I know," he said. "I am slow." "You are thorough," she said. "There is a difference." He looked at the map, then back at her. "Would you stay, not as my housekeeper? I mean, would you consider staying as—" He stopped again, and she could see the effort it took him, this man who had spent 18 months building walls against wanting anything. "Are you trying to ask me something specific?" she asked. "I am trying to ask you to marry me," he said, "and I am doing a terrible job of it." She felt the words land in her chest, warm and certain, and right in a way she had not expected to feel anything be right again after Thomas, after the boarding house in Abilene, after the letter on the kitchen table that had felt like the end of everything. She felt it, and she let herself feel it, and she thought about how arriving at this moment had required every difficult thing that had come before it, the secrets and the betrayal and the confrontation and the slow, honest rebuilding, and she thought that perhaps that was how real things were made, not easily but truly. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He reached across the map and took her hand. Not tentatively this time, not with the careful caution of the man who had held her hands by the stove in February and let go, but with certainty. He held her hand like a man who has decided to stop apologizing for wanting what he wants. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, and she was smiling now, and he was smiling back, that unguarded smile that she had first seen in the bluebonnet basin. "Just do not go back to the ledgers and forget you said that." "Not a chance," he said. They were married in August 1884 at the small Lutheran church in Kerrville on a Saturday when the hill country heat lay heavy and golden over everything, and the cicadas were loud enough to nearly drown the minister. Inez wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored muslin with eyelet trim, nothing elaborate, but it was beautiful in the way that things made with care and intention are always beautiful. Grant wore his best dark suit and a new hat, and looked at her when she came up the aisle of the little church with the particular expression of a man who cannot quite believe his good fortune, and is trying to fix the moment in his memory so he will not lose it. Clay Briggs sat in the front row and cried without any apparent embarrassment. Pedro Martinez sat beside him and looked profoundly pleased with himself, as though the whole outcome had been his doing. In the row behind them sat Inez Bancroft, who had aged visibly in the months since Inez had found him in the dry goods store, but who looked, for the first time since she had known him as a living man, something approaching peaceful. There was no one there from Inez's mother's side, because Ruth Bancroft had not come from Abilene, and Inez had not expected her to, and she had made her peace with that before she put on the dress. There was a letter from her mother in the tin box under what had been her bed, now to be moved to the room she would share with Grant, a letter that was warmer than the first and spoke carefully about happiness and about the time it takes to find it. Inez would write back in the fall. Some things needed season. After the ceremony and a dinner at the hotel on Main Street that Elias had insisted on paying for, they drove back to Sweetwater Ridge in the wagon in the long August evening, and the stars came out over the hill country in their hundreds as they always did in August, white and close and thick as cream. Inez sat on the wagon seat with her shoulder against Grant's and her hand on his arm, and neither of them spoke for a long time, just listening to the horses' hooves and the crickets and the settling quiet of the land they were driving home through. "Are you afraid?" he asked eventually. She considered the question seriously, the way he had learned she considered all serious questions. "No," she said. "I was afraid when I arrived here, and I was afraid when I read that letter, and I was afraid the morning I rode to Careville. I used up a great deal of fear." She looked up at the stars. "I think I am done with it for a while." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and that was how they drove home to Sweetwater Ridge, and it was entirely sufficient. The first year of marriage was full and complicated, and occasionally difficult in the ordinary ways that life between two strong-willed and complicated people is always difficult, and also full of pleasures that Inez had not allowed herself to expect. Grant proved to be a man who said little and did much, which she found entirely compatible with her own way of being, and they developed the rhythms of shared life with the same practical focus they had both always brought to the work in front of them. In October, 3 months after the wedding, Inez received a letter from her mother that was different from the previous ones. Ruth Bancroft had made the trip from Abilene to Careville. She had stayed at the hotel and had dinner with Inez Bancroft, her first time in his company in 11 years, and the letter described the dinner with careful precision, as if Ruth were reporting a scientific observation rather than a profoundly personal experience. She wrote that Inez looked old. She wrote that he had apologized, and that she had accepted the apology in the way one accepts a thing that is late but still of value. She wrote that she thought she might come to Sweetwater Ridge in the spring. Inez read the letter twice and then gave it to Grant. He read it and handed it back. "Your mother is braver than she knew," he said. "She always was," Inez said. "She just pointed it in the wrong direction for a long time." The spring of 1885 brought Ruth Bancroft to Sweetwater Ridge for a week in April, when the bluebonnets were up again in the limestone basin, and the weather was mild, and the ranch was at its most persuasive. Ruth was 61 years old and spare and precise, very much the schoolteacher she had been for 30 years, and she arrived on the stage from Careville and stepped down into the dusty ranch yard with the air of a woman, conducting an inspection she had been postponing for some time. Grant met her with the same quiet courtesy he brought to everything, shook her hand, took her bag, and showed her to the house without ceremony, and Inez watched her mother take in the kitchen and the freshly pressed curtains and the pot of something good smelling on the stove and the books on the table and the general evidence of a household that was functioning and alive, and she watched the inspection soften. "He seems like a good man," Ruth said that evening, when Grant had gone out to the barn. "He is," Inez said. "He had to remember how to be." Ruth looked at her. "And you had to teach him." "We taught each other, I think," Inez said. Ruth put her hand over Inez's on the table, brief and awkward and genuine. "I am sorry it took me so long to come." "You are here now," Inez said. "That counts." Inez came for Sunday dinner that week, which Inez had arranged deliberately and with careful thought, deciding that she was done managing the distance between the people in her life and would instead simply set the table and see who came. He arrived with his hat in his hands and a jar of honey from his bees, and a constraint in his face that dissolved somewhat, when Ruth Bancroft met him in the yard and said, simply, "Inez," in a voice that was neither warm nor cold but something more complicated than either. Dinner that Sunday was the strangest and most fully alive meal Inez could remember. Grant at the head of the table, steady and real. Clay Briggs invited in from the bunkhouse, because Clay at the table was always better than Clay not at the table. Pedro Martinez, who was seeing a young woman from town and glowed with it. Inez and Ruth on opposite sides of the table, talking carefully about small things, the mule story, the price of flour, the peculiarities of the hill country spring, and under all the small things the very large thing of two people in their 60s having a second chance at ordinary civility that they had forfeited by choice a long time ago. After dinner, Inez stood at the kitchen window and watched Inez and Ruth walk along the fence line in the late afternoon. They walked apart, not touching, talking slowly, and she could not hear what they said, but she watched them and thought about how time moves strange, how a person can lose 11 years to a lie and then find a Sunday afternoon in May to walk along a fence in the Texas Hill Country and say the things that should have been said before. Grant came to stand beside her. "I did not arrange that," she said. "I know, I just set the table. Sometimes," he said, "that's all that's needed." She leaned back against him and he put his arms around her, and they watched Elias and Ruth walk, and the bluebonnets were blue on the hillside, and the whippoorwill had started up in the draw, and it was entirely, completely good. In June of 1885, Inez told Grant she was expecting. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with the matter-of-fact directness that was her way of handling important things, and watched his face go through a sequence of expressions she had never seen before, surprise and wonder, and something she could only identify as a specific variety of joy that she suspected he had forgotten was available to him. He stood up and came around the table and took her hands, both of them, and held them in his and looked at her face. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling perfectly fine," she said. "I am constitutionally robust, as my mother would say." "Your mother is right," he said, and then he did something that surprised her by being exactly right. He simply held her hands and stood there for a minute, just present, just taking it in, not filling the moment with words. Clay Briggs, when he was told, looked at the ceiling and said, "Well, Lord, took you long enough," to an apparently unspecified celestial authority, and then blew his nose into his handkerchief with great feeling. Pedro Martinez took off his hat and grinned and said, "I will teach the child to rope. Just say when." Inez Bancroft, told over the counter of the dry goods store, went very still and then sat down abruptly on the stool behind him and put his hands over his face, and when he took them away his eyes were wet and he said, "A grandchild," as if he were testing whether the word would break. It did not break. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Inez attributed to the good sense of getting enough sleep, the physical conditioning of a life of actual work, and the excellent food that came from a kitchen she managed with precision. She continued to run the household through the summer and into the fall, adapting as needed, and Grant adapted with her without being asked, taking on tasks she was better to avoid, staying close in ways that were not hovering but were simply present. In September, she finally talked him into the trip to San Antonio. He had been talking about the cattle auction, going back and forth about whether to make the journey, and she finally said plainly, "Eleanor's sister is there, and you have not seen her since the funeral, and I think you should, and I think we should go together." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." The trip to San Antonio was 3 days by wagon, staying at inns along the way, and it was the first real journey they had made together, and it was revelatory in the small, domestic way that shared travel always is. She learned that Grant woke up earlier than anyone should reasonably be awake, was cheerful about it in a way that took some adjustment, ate very little for breakfast and was ravenous by noon, and had a habit of pointing out specific features of the landscape. This limestone formation, that spring, the particular bend where 2 rivers met, with the quiet pride of a man who knows his geography personally, as though the land had spoken it to him directly over 34 years. She told him about Galveston, about the city before the flood that was used as a cover for her father's disappearance, about the Gulf of Mexico, which she had not seen since she was a small girl, about the way salt air smelled and how she had always thought she would go back someday. "We'll go," he said. "After." "After what?" "After the baby. In the spring. We'll take the train to Houston and then down." He said it with the easy certainty of a man making plans, a man who assumed futures. She looked at him on the wagon seat with the Texas sun on his hat brim and the whole of the long September landscape opening out before them, and she felt it again, that same thing she had felt the night he asked her to marry him, the rightness of it, the solidity, the sense of something built on truth rather than on whatever had come before. Eleanor's sister was a woman named Carla Howe, a small, decisive person of 40, who received them in her parlor in San Antonio with the mixture of grief and relief that Inez had expected. She and Grant sat together on the settee, and Carla talked about Alina, the Alina she had known as a child and a girl and a young woman before Sweetwater Ridge. The Alina Grant had not always seen because you don't always see the earliest version of a person. Inez listened and learned about Alina's particular laugh, her determination, her fear of horses that she had never fully conquered, her love for the color blue, and she added this to what she already understood about Grant Warren's history, not as a shadow or a competition, but as context, as the full picture of a man who had loved and lost and was learning to love again. Carla held Inez's hands at the door when they left and said, "She would have liked you." "I hope so," Inez said. "I would have liked her." Their son was born on a cold, clear morning in February of 1886, which was, as Clay Briggs observed, exactly the right time of year for a hill country baby, because the bluebonnets would be coming in a few months and a child should see bluebonnets as early as possible. They named him James Elias Warren, James for Grant's father and Elias for a grandfather who was going to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve the honor. And when Inez placed him in Inez Bancroft's arms that first Sunday, the old man sat in the rocking chair by the kitchen window and held his grandson and was entirely quiet for 20 minutes, which was how Inez knew it had reached him properly. Grant held his son with the same careful certainty he brought to everything he had learned to do, and looked at Inez over the baby's head with an expression she did not have a word for because it was too many things at once: wonder and love, and the specific humility of a man who has been given more than he believed he deserved, and has finally, carefully, accepted it. James Elias Warren grew from a good, solid baby into an interested and sturdy toddler, and the ranch accommodated him as ranches do, by becoming his world, and he found Clay Briggs endlessly fascinating, following the old man around the yard on his uncertain legs, and Pedro Martinez, who was now engaged to the young woman from town, a schoolteacher's daughter named Alma, held to his promise and began the foundational education in roping at the age of 14 months, which Clay observed was probably too early, but one could never be certain. In the fall of 1887, Inez's mother Ruth made the decision to retire from teaching in Abilene and move to Careville. She did not announce this decision until it was already made, which was very much Ruth's way, and she arrived in October with her belongings and took a room at the boarding house while she looked for a more permanent situation. And Inez Bancroft, who had been quietly and carefully, and without pressure courting her friendship for 2 years, helped her find a small house on a street with a live oak in the front yard that Ruth declared entirely acceptable. Inez and Grant rode into Careville the week after Ruth arrived and had dinner with both her parents at the hotel, which was a thing she had not expected to do in this life, and which carried with it a strange, complicated joy. Elias and Ruth were not what they had been, and they were not together in any romantic sense, but they were something real, something honest, two people who had damaged each other and themselves by their choices and were now choosing to be, at minimum, present and genuine, and that was not nothing. In fact, Inez thought, watching them across the dinner table, it was quite a lot. Grant squeezed her hand under the table during the dessert course, and she looked at him, and he tipped his head almost imperceptibly at her parents, and in his eyes was the same thought she was having, the observation they were both making about how long roads run and where they sometimes end up. The spring trip to Galveston finally happened in April of 1888, when James was 2 years old and manageable on a train, and Grant made good on the promise he had made in September on the road to San Antonio. They took the train from San Antonio to Houston and then south, and when the Gulf appeared on the horizon, first as a shimmer and then as a flat and enormous blue, Inez felt something in her chest that was part grief and part homecoming, and part the specific emotion of being, at last, in a place you had thought was permanently behind you. They stayed 2 nights at a hotel near the waterfront. James Warren saw the ocean for the first time in his young life and responded with a focused, serious interest that made both his parents laugh. Grant stood on the beach at Galveston with his boots in his hand and the Gulf of Mexico at his feet, which was about as far outside his natural landscape as it was possible to get, and looked at it with the open curiosity of a man who is still finding the world surprising, which was, Inez thought, one of the best things about him. "Is it what you remembered?" he asked. "It's exactly what I remembered," she said, "and also completely different because the last time I stood here I was 8 years old and did not know any of what was coming." She looked out at the water. "That's true of most places, I suppose. The place is the same. The person looking at it isn't." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, same as she had that first night driving home from the wedding, and James sat down firmly in the sand and began investigating it with both hands, and the Gulf moved in and out in its slow, patient rhythm, and it was a very good day. They came home to Sweetwater Ridge in late April, when the bluebonnets were still up in the limestone basin, and Inez stood on the porch in the morning and looked out at the land, at the cedar and live oak, at the pale limestone road leading out toward Careville, at the barn and the bunkhouse, and the fence lines running across the hills. And she thought about the woman who had arrived here a year and a half before on a stage from Abilene with 2 bags and a careful letter, and the specific desperate hope of someone who has nowhere else to turn. She thought about how that woman had walked into a house built on a secret and made it honest. She thought about the rancher who had stood on the porch with guilt on his face and forgotten, somewhere along the way of grief, how to want things or hope for them. She thought about what it meant to teach someone that. Not to lecture, not to preach, but to demonstrate it by living it, by asking hard questions and staying through the answers, by opening windows in rooms that had been shut too long, by setting a table and seeing who came. She heard James's voice from inside the house, rising in the particular morning register of a 2-year-old who has discovered something urgent, and she heard Grant's voice, low and calm and amused, responding. She heard the boy laugh. Grant came out on the porch a moment later with James balanced on his hip, both of them bright-eyed in the morning, James having apparently determined that today he would wear his father's hat, which sat on his small head down to his ears and gave him the look of a man with strong opinions. Grant came to stand beside her and they looked out at the land together, the 3 of them in the early spring morning. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking it was a long road," she said. "Worth it." She looked at him. She looked at James in his hat with his father's dark eyes and his mother's particular expression of focused assessment. She looked at the bluebonnets visible on the hillside, blue and bright against the limestone. She looked at the house behind them, clean and warm and alive with the presence of 2 people who had chosen each other with full knowledge and complete honesty. "Entirely," she said. James reached out from his father's hip and grabbed a fistful of her hair with the possessive affection of the very small, and she laughed and untangled herself and took him from Grant's arms and held him against her side. And James immediately looked out at the land with the same proprietary gravity he had been practicing since he learned to walk, as though already understanding that this was his, this limestone and cedar, this sky. Grant's hand rested on her back, steady and warm. There was news she had not told him yet, which she would tell him this evening at the kitchen table, that James would not be the only one for long. 3 months was still early, but she was constitutionally robust, as her mother would say, and she was not a woman who was afraid of what was coming. She had, in fact, spent a great deal of time lately not being afraid of what was coming. In September of 1888, Clay Briggs finally retired from active cattle work, his back having made an argument he could no longer counter, and he moved to a small house in Careville that he had bought with 30 years of careful saving. And Pedro and Alma Martinez moved into the foreman's house on the ranch, because Pedro had been doing foreman's work for 2 years already, and it was past time to call it what it was. Alma, who was 24 and sharp and kind, became a close friend to Inez in the way that women sometimes become friends across a shared practical world, and they spent many mornings in the kitchen together while the men were out, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't, and Inez was glad for it. The second baby was a girl, born in November of 1888, which was a cold, still month in the hill country that year. They named her Clara Ruth Warren, Clara for no particular reason except that it suited her, and Ruth for a grandmother who was in the room when she arrived, who held her granddaughter with the expression of a woman who has spent a long time doing penance and has been given more than she bargained for in return. Clara Ruth Warren was smaller than her brother had been and considerably louder about her opinions from the first, and James Warren, age 2, inspected her with the serious interest he brought to all new developments in his world, and then went back to his trucks and his father's hat, apparently satisfied. Grant stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at his wife in the bed with his daughter in her arms, and Inez looked back at him, and she thought about the man who had stood on a porch with a hat in his hands and guilt on his face a little over 4 years ago, who had forgotten how to want things or plan for them, or believe that anything good was still possible. She thought that man would not recognize himself in the man standing in the doorway now. He came and sat beside the bed, and she shifted Clara Ruth to him, and he held his daughter with the same ease he had developed with James, which was to say, the ease of a man who has had practice, and Clara immediately grabbed his finger in her small fist and held on with the specific determination she would maintain for the rest of her life. 2, he said. Yes, she said. I had not imagined 2. You were not imagining much of anything when I arrived, she pointed out. He smiled, and it was the unguarded one, the one she had first seen in the Bluebonnet Basin, the one that she had given herself partial credit for releasing into the world. No, he said, I wasn't. He looked at his daughter. What do you hope for them? She thought about it. I hope they are allowed to want things, she said, and that they learn early that wanting is not weakness, that hoping is not foolishness. She looked at Clara's small face. I hope they know that a long road is not a wrong road. Grant looked at her across their daughter's head, and she saw in his face the same thing she had seen the very first time she had asked him what he hoped for, standing in the kitchen on New Year's morning 4 years ago, except that now the answer was not halting or afraid. It was sure. I hope the same things, he said, and I hope they have someone like you to show them. They have you, she said. That counts considerably more than you think. He leaned over and kissed her forehead carefully, not wanting to disturb the sleeping Clara, and she put her free hand on his face for a moment, feeling the roughness of his jaw and the warmth of him, and the entirety of the life they had built from a secret and a letter and a woman with 2 bags who had decided to stay. Outside the window, the hill country November was cold and still. The cedar brakes were dark against the pale evening sky. A fire was burning in the kitchen, tended by Alma Martinez, who had also been present for the birth and was now engaged in the practical business of making sure everyone was fed. James Warren was asleep in his room, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Inez Bancroft had gone back to Careville in the late afternoon, promising to return Sunday with honey and whatever else a grandfather could be relied upon to bring, and Ruth Bancroft had stayed and was somewhere in the house, perhaps in the kitchen with Alma, perhaps in the rocking chair in the parlor, present in the way she had learned to be present, having finally understood that presence was the thing she owed. Grant was here. Inez was here. Clara Ruth Warren was here, 1 day old and already holding on. Sweetwater Ridge was not what it had been in the hollow, shuttered months after Aliner's death, when a man had managed days without wanting anything, and a house had sat with 2 plates and 1 cup, and a name scratched off a coffee tin. It was a house full of people and dogs and the particular productive noise of a working ranch. A house where plans were made and carried out and revised and made again, where questions were asked and answered honestly, where the kitchen table had been the site of confrontations and confessions and wedding discussions and bluebonnet season breakfasts and Sunday dinners with people who were learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be what they should have been to each other all along. It was a house that had been taught to hope again, by a woman who arrived with nothing but her own willingness to stay and find out who was worth trusting. She lay back against the pillow and let her eyes close, and Grant took his daughter carefully and held her so that Inez could rest, and the fire crackled in the kitchen, and the stars came out one by one over the hill country, clear and close and thick as they always were in November. And somewhere down in the draw the whippoorwill called, and everything was, at last and completely, resolved. James Warren grew up to be a man who knew the name of every cedar brake on his father's land and could ride before he could read, and read voraciously once he learned, and who had his mother's habit of asking the real question instead of the polite one, and his father's habit of meaning what he said. Clara Ruth Warren grew up to be a woman who held on to things with great determination, exactly as she had held her father's finger on her first day of life, and who had her mother's organized precision and her father's quiet certainty, and who terrified every suitor who came to Sweetwater Ridge, which both her parents found satisfying. Ruth and Inez Bancroft never married again, not each other and not anyone else, but they spent the last years of their lives within 12 miles of each other, which seemed to be the correct distance, and they came to Sunday dinner reliably for 17 years, and Inez brought honey and Ruth brought criticism of the pie crust that was exactly accurate, and they sat on opposite sides of the table and talked about small things that contained large things, and it was, on balance, more than they deserved and exactly what they made of it. Clay Briggs outlived his expected span by a considerable margin, dying at 71 in his small Careville house with his hound dog at his feet and a book in his hand, which was how he said he intended to go, and which everyone who knew him believed he arranged deliberately. Pedro and Alma Martinez had 4 children and ran Sweetwater Ridge for 30 years, and it flourished under them because they were excellent people who did excellent work. And Grant Warren told anyone who asked that the best decision he ever made in terms of the ranch was understanding that the right people, given authority and trust, will build something better than you could build alone. Grant Warren, for his part, lived long enough to teach both his grandchildren to ride, which was the thing he said he hoped for when James's son was born, sitting at the kitchen table with Inez across from him, the same way they had sat 4 years into their marriage when he was making fence plans, and they were beginning to understand what they were to each other. He said it without hesitation, the way a man says things when he has been practicing hope for long enough that it comes naturally. Inez Bancroft Warren ran her household and her husband, and the people around both with the same organized, patient, honest precision she had always brought to everything. And she grew old with the particular beauty of a woman who has been doing what she actually believes in for a long time. She went back to Galveston twice more in her life, the last time at 55, and stood on the beach with the Gulf of Mexico moving at her feet and thought about all the things she had not known were coming when she was 8 years old looking at the same water. And she thought that if she had been told, she would not have believed any of it, not the long road or the secret, or the letter, or the rancher with guilt on his face who turned out to contain more hope than even he knew. She would not have believed the part where it became entirely, completely good, but it was all of that and more. And Sweetwater Ridge stood on its limestone hill in the hill country of Texas for a very long time after, with the cedar and the live oak growing around it, and the bluebonnets coming up in the basin every April and the whippoorwill calling in the draw every evening, and it was a place where people had come back to life, and it smelled of coffee and wood smoke and bread, and the door was never locked.